This is the first in a series of resources that look at broad topics in macroeconomics. Part 1 considers the gross domestic product, defining it and each component part, working through a couple of examples, and considering the limitations of the GDP as a measure of welfare. Part 2 considers the difference between public and private goods and looks at certain issues arising from public goods. Part 3 inspects the difference between real and nominal measures, working through an example. Part 4 looks at unemployment, providing definitions for various types of unemployment, and also defining other factors involved in calculating unemployment rates. Part 5 considers the Consumer Price Index, defining it, working through examples, and explaining how the CPI applies to actual real-world problems. Part 6 looks at economic growth, suggesting general methods countries can use to expand their economy. Macroeconomics considers economic concerns for an entire nation, rather than focusing on a single firm or a single market. One major topic for macroeconomics is the idea of the overall economic health of a nation. This is usually measured by the gross domestic product, which is the total market value of final goods and services produced in a given year. There are a couple of things to point out with this definition. First, the products must be final. That is, products in production are not factored into GDP. Also, GDP only measures new products. Purchasing used goods does not factor into gross domestic product either. In formula terms, the gross domestic product, denoted Y, is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. But what do each of those variables represent? C represents the total of all consumption expenditures. I is the total investment. G is the sum of all government purchases, whether they are at the federal, state, or local level. And NX is net purchases made by the foreign sector. So it is the total of all exports minus all imports. Let's look at each of these components of the gross domestic product more closely. The first component of the gross domestic product are consumption expenditures. These are purchases made by private individuals. These purchases can be durable goods, non-durable goods, or services. A durable good is a product expected to last a long time, usually meaning more than 5 years. Examples include things like cars or refrigerators. A non-durable good lasts only a short amount of time, like food. A service means that people play a prominent role in the delivery of that action. Getting a haircut or getting your taxes done at H&R Block are examples of services. However, having a cashier ring up your purchases at the grocery store is not considered a service because the primary act is procuring the groceries, not the act of checking out. Investments are primarily purchases made by companies in an attempt to expand their business potential. This includes any spending on new plants or equipment, or expanding their stock of inventory. However, investment also includes purchases of new houses. Remember, only new purchases factor into the gross domestic product. Buying an old house does not count. The total of all these investment purchases is the gross investment, which does not account for depreciation. However, the I component of GDP uses net investment, which subtracts depreciation expense from the gross investment. Government purchases are, oddly enough, Purchases of new goods or services made by the government. These can be at the local, state, or federal level of government. This component of the gross domestic product also includes all wages and the costs of benefits for all government employees. However, the government component of GDP does not include transfer payments, or payments that do not correspond to the transfer of goods or services. In the United States, things like welfare payments, Social Security, and Medicare do not factor into the gross domestic product, even though they represent the majority of the cost of the federal budget. The final component of the gross domestic product is the net exports. An import is a good or service produced in a foreign country. An export is a good or service produced in the domestic country but sold in a foreign country. The net exports is then the total of all the exports minus all the imports. If this total is negative, there is a trade deficit because the exports are less than the imports. A positive total indicates a trade surplus, as there are more exports than imports. Now that we have defined all the components of the gross domestic product, let's look at a couple of examples. First, we will look at a basic example. Suppose some nation had consumption expenses of $10,234 billion, investment of $1,716 billion, government spending of $2,960 billion, and a $449 billion trade deficit. What is the gross domestic product of this nation? To find the GDP, we simply add all the components together. Doing so, the GDP of this nation is $14,461 billion, or $14.461 trillion. Now let's see a slightly more involved example. Suppose the nation of Delandia has a very simple economy, in which they only produce a single computer model sold for $500. In the year 2010, the citizens of Delandia bought 120 computers. That same year, the government bought 30 computers. The producers of the Delandic computers invested $1 million purchasing a new production facility. The nearest neighbor of Delandia, Farmerland, bought 200 computers. In return, the Delandic residents imported and purchased 20,000 bushels of potatoes at a cost of $2.50 per bushel. What was the 2010 gross domestic product for Delandia? Recall that the formula for gross domestic product, Y, equals consumption expense, C, plus investment, I, plus government spending, G, plus net exports, NX. To find the GDP, first we need to find each of these components. The consumption expense is equal to the 120 computers purchased by the citizens multiplied by the $500 per computer cost, or $60,000. The investment equals the cost of the new facility, or $1 million. The government spending was 30 computers multiplied by the $500 per computer cost, or $15,000. To find the net exports, we have to factor both the exports sold to Farmerland and the potatoes imported into Delandia. The exports were 200 computers at $500 per computer. The imports were 20,000 bushels of potatoes at $2.50 per bushel. Subtracting exports minus imports, the net exports were $70,000. Putting this all together, we find that the 2010 gross domestic product for Delandia was $1,145,000. Since the gross domestic product is a measure of the economic health of a nation, it is calculated at regular intervals. Because of this, the GDP may fluctuate from month to month. In other words, a graph tracking GDP will have peaks and troughs. This leads to some official definitions. A recession occurs when the GDP declines in real terms for 6 consecutive months by removing the effects of inflation. Expansion occurs when the GDP is on an upswing after a trough. But just how effective a measure is the gross domestic product? While used as a measure of the overall health of an entire nation, the GDP is not a reliable measure of the actual welfare of the citizenry of a nation. There are a number of factors to the comfort of life not included in the calculation of GDP. Included among those factors are housework and childcare, especially if done at home, leisure time, any underground economy, and levels of pollution. Overall, the gross domestic product measures the economic health of a nation, not the nation's people.